Sometimes the hardest thing about having everything is realizing you have no one to share it with. For 7 long years, Hakon the Giant has spent every Christmas alone in his vast hall, setting places at his table for ghosts that will never return. This wealthy Viking chieftain once ruled the seas, but now he rules only silence and sorrow. His servants whisper that their master's heart died the same winter his family was lost to the storms. Every Yule, he lights candles and prepares grand feasts, hoping somehow the warmth will fill the emptiness inside his chest. But this Christmas Eve, 2 strangers arrive at his gates seeking shelter from a deadly blizzard. An elderly woman named Brynhild and her gentle daughter Elin will change everything Hakon thought he knew about loss, hope, and what it means to find family again. Can love really bloom in the coldest season of grief? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind howled through the pine forests of northern Norway like the voices of ancient gods, carrying with it the bite of winter that could freeze a man's breath in his lungs. High above the tree line, where the mountains touched the grey December sky, stood a fortress of timber and stone that seemed to defy both nature and time itself. This was Hakon's domain, a sprawling estate carved from the wilderness by his own hands and maintained by the wealth he had gathered from decades of conquest across the northern seas. Hakon Eriksson, known throughout the fjords as Hakon the Giant, stood 7 feet tall in his boots, with shoulders broad enough to block a doorway and hands that could crush stone or cradle a newborn lamb with equal ease. His beard, once the color of burnished copper, now bore threads of silver that caught the firelight when he turned his head. Deep lines mapped his weathered face, some from squinting into ocean spray during countless voyages, others from the weight of sorrows too heavy for any man to bear alone. The great hall stretched before him like a cathedral built for giants, its ceiling supported by massive oak beams that had been hewn from trees older than memory. Carved dragons writhed along the posts, their eyes inlaid with amber that seemed to flicker with life in the dancing shadows. The walls bore shields and weapons from his raiding days, each one a story, each one a victory that now felt hollow as winter air. Tapestries woven by the finest craftswomen in the land depicted scenes of his greatest triumphs, but Hakon rarely looked at them anymore. What good were tales of glory when there was no one left to share them with? At the center of the hall stood his greatest treasure and his deepest torment, a dining table carved from a single enormous tree trunk, polished to a mirror shine and set permanently for 12 guests. Every plate was crafted from the finest silver, every cup from horn, rimmed with gold. The centerpiece was a massive candelabra forged by master smiths, its branches reaching toward the ceiling like the limbs of an iron tree. This table had once groaned under the weight of feast after feast, surrounded by the laughter of his beloved wife Astrid and their 3 children, Eric, Sigrid, and little Magnus, who had barely learned to walk when fate snatched them all away. Now the table mocked him with its emptiness. Every Christmas Eve for 7 years, Hakon had ordered his servants to prepare the same elaborate meal, to light every candle, to fill every cup with the finest mead. And every Christmas Eve he sat alone at the head of that table, raising silent toast to the dead, while the food grew cold and the candles burned down to nothing. His servants moved through the hall like ghosts themselves, speaking in whispers and avoiding their master's eyes. They had watched the mighty Hakon Eriksson transform from a man who could laugh loud enough to shake the rafters into someone who rarely spoke above a murmur. Old Gunnar, his steward, had served the family for 30 years and remembered when this hall rang with children's laughter and Astrid's gentle singing. Now he worried that his master was slowly dying of a broken heart, growing thinner each year despite the abundance that surrounded him. Master, Gunnar ventured that Christmas Eve, his voice barely audible above the crackling of the great hearth. Perhaps this year you might consider "The table will be set as always," Hakon interrupted, not turning from where he stood, gazing out the great window toward the fjord below. "Every place, every cup, every candle. You know the way of it." Gunnar bowed his grey head. He did know the way of it. They all did. It was a ritual, as fixed as the turning of the seasons, as inevitable as the sunrise. The master would dress in his finest robes, deep blue wool, trimmed with silver thread, the same colours Astrid had loved. He would take his place at the head of the table and speak to the empty chairs, as if his family still occupied them, telling them about the harvest, about the new calves born in spring, about how the apple trees had grown taller. The tragedy that had claimed them lived in this hall like a fourth presence, as real and constant as the furniture. 7 winters ago, Astrid had insisted on making the journey to her sister's wedding in a distant village, despite Hakon's warnings about the late-season storms. She had laughed at his caution, her blue eyes sparkling with mischief. "You worry too much, my giant," she had teased, standing on her toes to kiss his bearded cheek. "We'll be back before the Yule celebrations, I promise." The children are so excited to see their cousins. They had sailed south along the coast in Hakon's finest longship, crewed by his most trusted men. But winter storms in these waters were living things of fury and malice, and this one had risen from nowhere like a beast from the depths. The ship had been found 3 days later, broken against the rocks of a tiny island, its crew and passengers claimed by the hungry sea. No bodies were ever recovered. The waves had taken everything: wife, children, men who had sailed with him through 100 battles. Hakon had searched for weeks, rowing through sleet and snow, calling their names until his voice was raw as torn sailcloth. He had offered fortunes to any man who could bring him word of survivors, had consulted every wise woman and seer from here to Iceland. But the sea keeps what the sea takes, and all his wealth and fury meant nothing against the ancient hunger of the depths. In the corner of the hall, nearly hidden behind a massive pillar, stood the carved runestone that had become his most precious possession. Taller than a man and covered in intricate knotwork, it bore the names of his lost family in runes he had cut himself with trembling hands. Astrid Thorsdottir, beloved wife; Erik Hakonsson, brave son; Sigrid Hakonsdottir, bright daughter; Magnus Hakonsson, laughing child. Below their names he had carved a single line in the old tongue, gone to the halls of the ancestors, but living still in the heart that remembers. He visited that stone every morning and every night, running his scarred fingers over the carved names until he could feel them in his sleep. Sometimes he would speak to it as if they could hear him, telling them about his dreams, about how the estate prospered, about how much he missed the sound of their voices. The servants had grown used to finding him there in the grey hours before dawn, his massive frame bent in grief before the monument to love and loss, the wealth that surrounded him, the gold in his strong boxes, the cattle in his fields, the ships in his harbours, had been accumulated for them, to build a legacy worthy of the Eriksson name. Now it felt like a burden, a weight that pressed down on his shoulders with each passing year. What good was gold when there was no one to inherit it? What purpose did his empire serve when there was no next generation to carry it forward? Outside, the wind grew stronger, rattling the shutters and sending snow spiraling past the windows like tiny white dancers. This Christmas Eve was shaping up to be one of the worst storms in memory, the kind that could bury a man in minutes and freeze the breath in his lungs. Any sensible person would be huddled by their hearth tonight. Grateful for warmth and shelter, Hakon moved to the great window and pressed his palm against the cold glass, watching the snow fall in the gathering darkness. In the distance, he could see the faint glow of the village lights, warm and welcoming. He knew that behind those windows, families were gathering for their own celebrations, children hanging stockings, mothers preparing special meals, fathers telling stories of Christmases past. The thought should have brought him comfort, knowing that life and joy continued in the world beyond his isolated hall. Instead, it only deepened the ache in his chest. "The table is ready, master," Gunnar announced quietly from behind him. Hakon nodded without turning. Soon he would take his place at that magnificent empty table and begin another solitary feast. He would pour wine for phantom guests and speak to memories that grew dimmer with each passing year. He would light the candles and watch them burn down while the wind sang its lonely song outside his walls. But tonight felt different somehow. Tonight, the very air seemed to hum with possibility, as if the storm carried more than just snow and ice. Tonight, something was coming to Hakon's hall. He could feel it in his bones, the way old sailors feel the change in weather before the sky shows any signs. He stood at that window for a long moment more, his reflection ghost-like in the dark glass, and waited for whatever the winter night might bring. The knock came just as Hakon raised his goblet in the first of his annual toasts to the dead. 3 sharp raps against the great oak doors of his hall. Urgent, desperate, barely audible above the howling wind. Hakon froze with the wine halfway to his lips, certain for a moment that grief had finally driven him to madness. No one traveled on nights like this. No one would dare attempt the treacherous mountain path to his estate in weather that could kill a man in minutes. The sound came again, louder this time, accompanied by a woman's voice calling out in words the storm swallowed before they could reach his ears. Hakon set down his goblet and rose from his chair, his massive frame casting long shadows across the empty feast table. Gunnar appeared from the kitchen, his weathered face creased with concern. "Master, surely no one would be abroad in such weather," the old steward said, but his words carried no conviction. They had both heard the knocking, both heard the voice. Hakon strode toward the entrance, his boots echoing against the stone floor. The great doors were barred against the storm, reinforced with iron bands and thick as a man's torso. He lifted the heavy wooden beam that secured them and pulled one door open, just wide enough to peer into the blizzard beyond. What he saw made him catch his breath. 2 figures huddled against his doorframe, so covered in snow they looked like spirits carved from winter itself. The taller one stepped forward into the dim light spilling from his hall, an elderly woman with silver hair plastered to her skull by melting snow, her weathered face determined, despite the obvious exhaustion in her eyes. Behind her stood a younger woman, perhaps 30 years of age, supporting what appeared to be a large bundle wrapped in oiled cloth. "Please." "Good sir," the older woman said, her voice strong despite the chattering of her teeth. "I am Brynhild Olafsdottir, and this is my daughter Elin. Our cart broke down on the mountain path, and we seek shelter from this storm." "I know it is much to ask of strangers, but—" "Come in," Hakon said, the words leaving his mouth before his mind had fully processed the decision. "Quickly, before you freeze to death on my doorstep." He stepped aside and watched as they stumbled into his hall, bringing with them a swirl of snow and wind that set the candle flames dancing. Gunnar hurried forward with thick woolen blankets, his servant's instincts overriding his surprise at having unexpected guests on this sacred night. As the women shed their snow-crusted cloaks, Hakon got his first clear look at them. Brynhild was indeed elderly, but there was nothing frail about her. She stood straight despite her years, and her eyes, pale blue like winter ice, held a sharpness that spoke of wisdom earned through hardship. Her daughter Elin was taller, with dark hair that fell in damp waves past her shoulders and brown eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She clutched their mysterious bundle protectively against her chest. "We were returning from the village market," Brynhild explained, as Gunnar draped a blanket around her shoulders. "The weather turned so quickly. One moment the sky was clear, the next we could barely see our own hands. Our cartwheels snapped against a stone, and our horse bolted when the thunder started." "The village market?" Hakon frowned. "That's 2 days' journey on foot, and no one travels those roads in winter." Elin spoke for the first time, her voice soft but clear. "Mama needed medicines that only the town healers carry." She stopped abruptly as her mother's hand touched her arm. "I am grateful for any shelter you can provide," Brynhild said firmly. "We can sleep in your stables if necessary. We don't wish to impose on your household." Hakon stared at them both, feeling as if the ground had shifted beneath his feet. For 7 years, this night had followed the same unchanging pattern. The feast prepared, the candles lit, the solitary toasts raised to empty chairs. Now these two women stood dripping snow onto his floor, their presence transforming his sacred ritual into something entirely unexpected. "You will not sleep in the stables," he said finally. "Gunnar, prepare the guest chambers. Build up the fires and see that our guests have everything they need." The old steward bowed and hurried away, clearly relieved to have tasks to focus on. Hakon remained standing in the center of his hall, unsure what to do with his hands, uncertain of the proper words. It had been so long since he'd spoken to anyone beyond his servants and the occasional merchant or village elder who came seeking his counsel. "You were preparing for a celebration," Elin observed, her gaze taking in the elaborately set table with its gleaming plates and burning candles. "Yes," Hakon said simply, offering no explanation. "We've interrupted your Christmas feast," Brynhild said, and there was something in her tone that made Hakon look at her more closely. "Your family must be wondering where their host has gone." The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Hakon felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the weight of words he had never learned to speak. How did one explain to strangers that this feast was for the dead, that he had been about to share his Christmas meal with ghosts and memories? "There is no family," he said at last, his voice barely above a whisper. "There hasn't been for 7 years. Understanding dawned in Brynhild's eyes, and with it came something Hakon hadn't seen directed at him in longer than he could remember. Compassion without pity, acknowledgement without judgment. "Then perhaps," she said gently, "we might share this meal with you instead? If you wouldn't mind the company of 2 snow-covered travelers who smell of wet wool and horses." The bundle in Elin's arms shifted, and a small sound emerged from within the cloth wrapping. Not quite a cry, not quite a whisper. Hakon's eyes widened as realization struck him. Do you carry a child?" Elin's face flushed, but she nodded. "My son Bjorn. He's only 6 months old." I tried to keep him warm, but without thinking Hakon moved closer. His massive hands, so accustomed to violence and solitude, reached out with surprising gentleness to part the cloth. A tiny face peered up at him, red-cheeked from the cold but alert, with bright blue eyes that seemed to look directly into his soul. The baby made another small sound, almost like a question, and one perfect little hand emerged from the wrappings to wave in the warm air of the hall. Something cracked inside Hakon's chest, not breaking but opening, like ice beginning to thaw after a long winter. "He's beautiful," Hakon whispered, and the words came out rougher than he intended. "Would you like to hold him?" Elin asked, and the offer hung in the air between them like a bridge across an impossible distance. Hakon's hands trembled as he reached out. He had held his own children once upon a time. Little Magnus had been just this size when the sea claimed him. But that was another life, another man who had known how to cradle an infant without fear. The baby settled into his arms as if he belonged there, his tiny fist curling around one of Hakon's fingers with surprising strength. Those bright eyes continued to stare up at him with the fearless curiosity of the very young. And for the first time in 7 years, Hakon felt something other than grief and emptiness fill the hollow spaces in his heart. "What did you say his name was?" he asked softly. "Bjorn," Elin replied. "It means bear," Hakon finished, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. A strong name for a brave little warrior. The storm continued to rage outside, but within the hall something had changed irrevocably. The empty feast table no longer seemed like a monument to loss, but a table that could be shared. The burning candles no longer illuminated, only memories but the faces of 3 unexpected guests who had brought more than shelter-seeking to his door. They had brought the possibility of Christmas as he had once known. It not a solitary ritual of remembrance, but a celebration of life, warmth, and the precious gift of human connection. Looking down at the baby in his arms, Hakon realized that for the first time in 7 years, he was no longer alone on Christmas Eve. The wooden cradle had been gathering dust in the storage chambers for 7 years, but Gunnar's hands remembered exactly where to find it. Carved from birchwood and inlaid with silver runes for protection and sweet dreams, it had once rocked little Magnus to sleep. Now it sat beside the great hearth, lined with the softest lamb's wool, ready to welcome another child into the warmth of Hakon's hall. "I carved this myself," Hakon said quietly as Elin settled baby Bjorn into the cradle. His large fingers traced the intricate patterns along the curved edges, spirals and knots that told stories of growth and continuity. "For my youngest son, it seems fitting that it should serve its purpose once more." Elin's eyes softened as she watched her child's face relax in the warm glow of the firelight. "It's beautiful. He looks so peaceful." Brynhild had accepted Gunnar's offer of dry clothes and now wore one of Astrid's old gowns, deep green wool with gold embroidery at the sleeves. The garment fit her well enough, though it hung loose in places that spoke of recent weight loss. She moved carefully, Hakon noticed, favoring her left side in a way that suggested either injury or illness. "Your wife had excellent taste," Brynhild said, smoothing the fabric with weathered hands. "This is finer than anything I've owned." "She did," Hakon replied simply. "She had a gift for making beautiful things, weaving, embroidery, singing. This hall was different when she lived here." They had moved away from the formal dining area to gather around the massive stone hearth that dominated one end of the hall. Gunnar had brought cushions and low tables, transforming the space into something more intimate than the imposing feast setting. The contrast struck Hakon forcefully. For 7 years, he had insisted on maintaining the rigid formality of his memorial dinners, but these strangers had somehow made his hall feel like a home again, simply by their presence. "Tell me about your family," Brynhild said gently as she accepted a bowl of warm stew from Gunnar. "If you don't mind an old woman's curiosity." Hakon settled into his chair, a massive piece of furniture carved from a single tree trunk and padded with bearskin. For a moment, he considered deflecting the question, as he had done countless times with well-meaning neighbors and concerned servants. But something about Brynhild's direct gaze and gentle manner made the words come easier than they had in years. "Astrid was the daughter of a shipbuilder in the next fjord," he began, his voice taking on the cadence of a much-told but rarely shared story. "I met her during a trading expedition when I was still more raider than settled man. She was the most beautiful woman I had ever seen, but more than that, she was kind. She saw something in me worth saving from the violence I had known." He paused to take a sip of wine, buying time to steady his voice. Elin listened with quiet attention while nursing Bjorn, and Brynhild nodded encouragingly. "We married the spring after we met, and she transformed this place from a warrior's stronghold into a true home. Eric came first, my heir, strong and brave like his grandfather. Then Sigrid, who had her mother's gift for music and her father's stubborn will. And finally Magnus." His voice caught and he cleared his throat roughly. "Magnus was barely walking when the sea took them. They went on a journey?" Elin asked softly. "A wedding celebration. Astrid's sister was marrying a merchant from the south, and despite my warnings about late-season storms, my wife insisted on attending. She said the children needed to know their cousins, that family was more important than my worries about weather." He stared into the fire, watching the flames dance like tiny figures. "She was right about family being important. I just wish I had been wrong about the storms." The wind howled outside the hall, rattling the shutters and reminding them all of the fierce weather that had brought them together. Baby Bjorn stirred in his cradle, making soft sounds that were not quite distress but not quite contentment either. "May I?" Hakon asked, rising from his chair. Elin nodded, and Hakon lifted the child with practiced ease. The baby settled against his broad chest, tiny fingers grasping at the silver brooch that held his cloak. For a moment, the only sounds in the hall were the crackling of the fire and the gentle rhythm of an infant's breathing. "You're good with him," Brynhild observed. "Not all men have that gift. I had practice," Hakon said, beginning to pace slowly around the hearth. The motion seemed to soothe both him and the child. Magnus had trouble sleeping through the night for his first year. I would walk these halls with him for hours, telling him stories about his ancestors and the great deeds of our people. What kind of stories? Elin asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. Hakon found himself smiling, the first real smile he had worn in longer than he could remember. Tales of Odin and his ravens, of Thor's mighty hammer, of brave warriors who sailed to the edge of the world and back. But also gentler stories about the first spring flowers pushing through snow, about wise bears who taught children the secrets of the forest, about stars that watched over sleeping babies. As if responding to his voice, Bjorn's eyes began to close, his small body relaxing completely into the warmth and security of Hakon's arms. The sight stirred something deep in the big man's chest, a feeling he had buried so thoroughly he had almost forgotten its name. Protectiveness mixed with tenderness. The ancient instinct to shield the innocent from harm. Where is his father? Hakon asked quietly, then immediately regretted the question. Forgive me. It's not my place to ask. He died before Bjorn was born, Elin replied without defensiveness. A fever took him along with many others in our village last winter. We had been planning to marry come spring. I'm sorry for your loss, Hakon said, and meant it deeply. Here was another soul touched by grief, another person trying to rebuild life from the ashes of shattered dreams. That's why we were traveling to the market town, Brynhild added. Elin needs work to support herself and the child. The town has more opportunities than our small village. Hakon felt a strange pang at the thought of them leaving once the storm passed. For the first time in 7 years, his hall felt alive again, warmed by more than fire, brightened by more than candles. The presence of a child especially seemed to awaken spaces in his heart he had thought permanently closed. What kind of work do you seek? He asked. I can weave, sew, tend gardens, keep accounts, Elin said. I'm not afraid of hard work, and I have some skill with healing herbs and birthing babies, Brynhild added. Though I'm not as strong as I once was. The admission hung in the air, and Hakon noticed again how carefully the older woman moved, how her breathing seemed slightly labored despite the warmth of the hall. Whatever had driven them out into the winter storm, he suspected it was more urgent than simple job-seeking. But for now, those concerns seemed distant. For now, there was warmth and companionship, the sweet weight of a sleeping child in his arms, and the unexpected gift of voices other than his own echoing through halls that had been silent too long. Christmas morning dawned grey and bitter, with snow still falling steadily beyond the frost-covered windows. Hakon woke before sunrise, as was his custom, but for the first time in years, the silence that greeted him was not complete. From somewhere in the hall came the soft murmur of women's voices and the gentle sounds of a baby stirring to wakefulness. He dressed slowly, uncertain how to navigate this new reality. His Christmas mornings had followed the same pattern for 7 years, a solitary walk to the runestone, a quiet breakfast alone, then hours spent in his study, reviewing ledgers or staring out at the frozen landscape. The presence of guests required a different approach, one he wasn't sure he remembered how to manage. When he emerged from his chambers, he found Brynhild sitting beside the cradle, humming a soft lullaby while Elin moved about the kitchen area, helping Gunnar prepare the morning meal. She wore another of Astrid's dresses, this one a deep blue that complemented her dark hair, and she moved with easy competence, as if she had been part of this household for years rather than hours. "Good morning," she said warmly when she noticed him. "I hope you don't mind that I offered to help with breakfast. I wanted to contribute something after your generous hospitality." "Of course not," Hakon replied, though he felt oddly displaced watching another woman work in Astrid's kitchen. It wasn't unpleasant exactly, but it stirred emotions he wasn't prepared to examine too closely. Brynhild looked up from where she sat with the baby. "Young Bjorn has been an excellent guest. He slept through the night without a sound, though I suspect that has more to do with feeling safe and warm than with his natural temperament." Hakon approached the cradle, marveling again at how naturally the child seemed to fit into this space. Baby Bjorn was awake now, his bright eyes tracking movement around the room with the intense curiosity of the very young. When he saw Hakon's face, his tiny mouth curved into what might have been a smile. "He seems to like you," Elin observed, wiping her hands on a kitchen cloth. "Not all children take to strangers so quickly. Perhaps he senses a kindred spirit," Brynhild said with a knowing look. "Both of them have learned to be strong in the face of loss." The words hung in the morning air like smoke from the hearth. Hakon felt exposed, as if this elderly woman could read the depths of his grief with disturbing accuracy. He had spent years building walls around his heart, and yet somehow these strangers seemed to see right through them. "The storm shows no signs of letting up," he said, deflecting the conversation towards safer ground. "You'll likely be staying another day at least. We're grateful for any shelter you can provide," Elin said quickly. "We don't want to impose—" "You're not imposing," Hakon interrupted, surprising himself with the firmness of his response. "This hall has been too quiet for too long. Your presence is welcome." The admission cost him something to make, but it felt important to say it aloud. These women had brought life back into his home, in ways he was only beginning to understand. The sound of Elin's laughter when Bjorn made funny faces, Brynhild's gentle humming as she rocked the cradle, even the simple domestic sounds of preparation and conversation, all of it worked together to awaken corners of his heart that had been dormant for years. After breakfast, while the storm continued to rage outside, Hakon found himself showing his guests around the hall in a way he hadn't done since Astrid's time. He pointed out the carved details in the wooden pillars, explained the stories depicted in the tapestries, and even shared some of the history behind his collection of weapons and shields. "This axe belonged to my grandfather," he said, lifting a massive double-bladed weapon from its place on the wall. "He carried it in the raid on Lindisfarne, and it never failed him in battle." "It's beautiful," Elin said, though she kept her distance from the weapon. "All that craftsmanship in service of war." "War was different then," Hakon said thoughtfully. "More personal, perhaps. A man knew his enemies and his reasons for fighting. Now I sometimes wonder if all that violence accomplished anything lasting." Brynhild, who had been listening quietly while bouncing Bjorn gently in her arms, spoke up. "Perhaps its purpose was to lead you here, to this moment. Sometimes the path to peace requires walking through conflict first." Her words carried a weight that suggested personal experience with difficult journeys. Hakon studied her face, noting again the careful way she moved and the occasional shadow that crossed her features when she thought no one was looking. "Tell me about your village," he said, as they settled once more around the hearth. "What drove you to risk travel in such weather?" Mother and daughter exchanged a look that spoke of conversations held in whisper and decisions made in desperation. Finally, Brynhild sighed and shifted Bjorn to her other arm. "Our village has been struggling," she said slowly. "The harvest was poor this year, and the winter has been harder than most. When the sickness came, the fever that took Elin's intended, it claimed many of our strongest workers. Those of us left behind have been doing what we can, but it's not enough," Elin finished quietly. "The village council decided that those who cannot contribute should seek opportunities elsewhere. Mama has been ill herself, though she tries to hide it. I thought if we could reach the market town, find work there." "You were cast out." Hakon's voice carried a dangerous edge. "In winter? With a child and an ailing woman?" "Not cast out exactly," Brynhild said diplomatically, "but encouraged to explore other options. The council wasn't unkind, just practical. Resources are limited, and they have to think of the whole community." Hakon's hands clenched into fists. He recognized the cold logic of such decisions. He had been forced to make similar choices during his raiding days, determining which crew members were worth the cost of feeding, which settlements could afford to spare tribute. But the thought of these two women and their baby being turned away from their home stirred something fierce and protective in his chest. "What's the name of your village?" he asked. "Grey Rock," Elin replied. "It's about 3 days' journey south of here, in the valley below the old mountain pass." Hakon knew the place, a small farming community that had always struggled with the harsh realities of northern life. He had occasionally traded with them, accepting their grain and wool in exchange for silver and protection from raiders. Good people, but hard-pressed by circumstances beyond their control. And you plan to make this journey on foot? In winter, with a baby? The stark impossibility of their situation hung heavy in the warm air of the hall. Hakon realized that these women hadn't just been caught by the storm. They had been driven out into weather that could easily have killed them all. The desperation required for such a choice spoke of troubles deeper than a simple poor harvest. The second day brought a brief respite from the storm, though the air remained knife-sharp with cold, and the snow lay drifted against the walls of the hall like frozen waves. Hakon found himself reluctant to let his guests venture outside, making excuses about dangerous conditions and unstable paths whenever Elin mentioned checking on the weather. The road won't be passable for days, he insisted over the morning meal, though they all knew the main route down the mountain had been cleared by countless travelers over the years. Better to wait until the weather truly breaks. Brynhild gave him a knowing look over her cup of warm honey wine. You're very kind to worry about our safety, she said diplomatically, though I suspect there might be other reasons you're reluctant to see us go. The observation struck closer to truth than Hakon was comfortable admitting. The presence of his unexpected guests had awakened something in him he had thought permanently buried, not just the desire for companionship, but a sense of purpose that went beyond maintaining his estate and counting his gold. For the first time in 7 years, he had reason to wake each morning that didn't involve simply enduring another day of solitude. I've been thinking about your situation, he said, deflecting Brynhild's gentle challenge. This journey to the market town, it's not just dangerous, it's unnecessary. Elin looked up from where she was feeding Bjorn, wariness creeping into her expression. What do you mean? Hakon had spent much of the sleepless night wrestling with an idea that felt both natural and terrifying. The rational part of his mind warned him against acting too quickly, against making decisions based on emotion rather than careful thought. But his heart, that long dormant organ that had stirred to life in the presence of a baby's smile and women's laughter, urged him toward a path he hadn't dared consider before. My estate requires management, he said carefully. Correspondence, accounts, coordination with the village councils in the valley. The harvest records alone require someone with a careful hand and good judgment. You're offering me work? Elin asked, her voice pitched between hope and disbelief. I'm offering you a position, Hakon corrected, as steward of the household accounts. The role would come with quarters for you and your mother naturally, and Bjorn would want for nothing. The silence that followed felt charged with possibility and uncertainty. Gunnar, who had been quietly serving their meal, paused in his movements to listen. Even baby Bjorn seemed to sense the importance of the moment, his bright eyes moving between the adults as if following their conversation. That's very generous, Brynhild said slowly. But we couldn't possibly— Why not? Hakon interrupted, feeling momentum building behind his words. This hall has been a tomb for 7 years. You've already proven you can bring life back to these rooms. Elin clearly has the skills I need, and you— He looked directly at the older woman. You have wisdom I could benefit from. What about when the weather improves? Elin asked quietly. When spring comes, and you grow tired of having strangers in your home? The question revealed her deeper fear, that this was charity born of seasonal loneliness, that he would eventually see them as burdens rather than companions. Hakon understood the concern. His reputation in the region was one of solitary grief, and most people assumed his isolation was by choice rather than circumstance. Spring is months away, he said. By then you'll know whether this arrangement suits you. And I'll know whether having a household that feels like a home again is something I can bear. The admission hung between them, like a bridge neither side was certain they should cross. Hakon realized he was asking them to take a leap of faith equal to his own, to trust that a grieving giant who had hidden from the world could learn to be part of one again. Brynhild shifted in her chair, and Hakon noticed again how carefully she moved. how she sometimes pressed her hand to her side when she thought no one was looking. Whatever illness had contributed to their desperate journey was clearly more serious than she wanted to admit. "There's something else," he said, his voice gentling. "I noticed you've been having some discomfort. My household has access to healers, medicines, warmth, and proper food. Whatever troubles you've been facing, they'll be easier to manage here than on the road or in some crowded market town." Tears gathered in Brynhild's eyes, though she blinked them back quickly. "You see too much," she said with a shaky laugh. "I've learned to notice when people are in pain," Hakon replied simply. "It's not a skill I would have chosen to develop." Elin reached across the small table to take her mother's hand. The gesture was gentle but protective, and Hakon saw in it the same fierce loyalty that had driven them into the winter storm rather than accept separation in their village. "What exactly would my duties involve?" Elin asked, and Hakon recognized the careful negotiation in her tone. She was considering his offer seriously, but she was also a mother with responsibilities that went beyond her own welfare, managing correspondence with trading partners, keeping track of livestock and harvest yields, maintaining household accounts. Hakon found himself warming to the subject as he spoke. Gunnar has been handling these tasks along with his other duties, but he's earned a lighter load in his advancing years. The work requires someone who can read and write well, who understands numbers, and who can deal diplomatically with village councils and merchant groups. "I can do all of that," Elin said with quiet confidence. "I know you can. I've watched you these past 2 days, the way you organize your thoughts, how you handle your son, the questions you ask. You have the right instincts." The baby in question chose that moment to reach toward Hakon with both tiny hands, making the soft sounds that seemed to be his way of demanding attention. Without thinking, Hakon extended his finger, which Bjorn grasped with surprising strength. "He's made his opinion clear," Brynhild observed, with the first genuine smile Hakon had seen from her. "Children often see things adults miss. Then you'll stay?" Hakon asked, not quite managing to keep the hope from his voice. "We'll try it," Elin said carefully. "For the winter, at least. But if either of us feels this isn't working, then you'll be free to leave, with my blessing and assistance in finding other arrangements," Hakon finished. "I'm not trying to trap you here. I'm trying to offer you something better than uncertainty and hardship." As the morning wore on, and they began to discuss practical arrangements, Hakon felt something shifting inside his chest, a loosening of the tight bands of grief that had constricted his breathing for so long. The hall around them seemed to grow brighter, as if the very stones were awakening from their long sleep of sorrow. For the first time since he had lost his family, Hakon dared to imagine a future that held more than mere survival. A week passed before the weather truly cleared, and by then, the temporary arrangement had begun to feel permanent in ways that both comforted and unsettled Hakon. Elin had proven herself remarkably capable with the household accounts, catching errors in the grain tallies that even Gunnar had missed, and organizing the correspondence with the efficiency that impressed the old steward. More importantly, she moved through the hall with growing confidence. No longer a guest seeking shelter, but a woman finding her place in a new home. Brynhild had taken charge of the kitchen gardens, despite the season, planning improvements for spring and cataloguing the dried herbs with the keen eye of someone who understood their medicinal properties. She had also begun telling stories in the evenings, tales of the old gods and heroes that captivated even Hakon, who thought he had heard every saga ever sung. But it was baby Bjorn who had most thoroughly conquered the hall and its master. The child had developed the habit of reaching for Hakon whenever the big man came into view, and Hakon found himself structuring his days around the infant's needs and moods. He would walk the halls with Bjorn when the baby grew fussy, telling him stories in the same gentle voice he had once used with his own children. "You're going to spoil him," Elin teased one evening as she watched Hakon carefully feeding the baby small spoonfuls of honeyed porridge. "Children should be spoiled," Hakon replied seriously. "There's plenty of hardship waiting for them when they grow older. Let them have sweetness while they can. The words carried more weight than he had intended, revealing depths of philosophy born from loss. Elin's expression grew thoughtful as she watched him with her son, and Hakon wondered what she saw, a lonely man playing at being a father again, or something more genuine. That night, after the others had retired to their chambers, Hakon found himself standing before the family runestone, as had become his evening ritual. But for the first time in years, he wasn't there to speak to the dead. Instead, he found himself asking them for guidance about the living. "I don't know what I'm doing, Astrid," he whispered to the carved stone. "These people need more than just shelter and employment. They need someone who knows how to be part of a family again, and I'm not sure I remember how." The stone offered no answers, but the familiar weight of his grief felt different somehow, less crushing, more like a cherished burden he carried by choice rather than necessity. His love for his lost family hadn't diminished, but it was no longer the only love his heart contained. A soft footstep behind him made him turn. Brynhild stood in the shadows, wrapped in a thick wool shawl, her silver hair gleaming in the candlelight. "I didn't mean to intrude," she said quietly. "I couldn't sleep and I heard you moving about." "No intrusion," Hakon assured her, stepping aside so she could see the runestone clearly. "I was just talking things through." Brynhild approached the monument with the reverence it deserved, running her weathered fingers over the carved names. "Beautiful work. You made this yourself?" "Yes. It seemed important that the hands that carved their names should be the same hands that had held them in life." "I understand," she said simply. "After Elin's father died, I carved his name into the doorframe of our home. Not as grand as this, but it served the same purpose, keeping him present even in his absence." They stood together in comfortable silence for several minutes. Two people who had learned that love doesn't end with death, but transforms into something both more precious and more painful. "You're afraid," Brynhild observed finally, her voice gentle but certain. "Of what?" "Of letting yourself care again, of building something new when the old still holds such power over your heart." Hakon considered denying it, but Brynhild's directness deserved honesty in return. "Every time I look at Bjorn, I see Magnus. Every time I hear Elin laugh, I remember Astrid's voice. How do I honor the dead while embracing the living?" "By understanding that love isn't a finite resource," Brynhild said, settling carefully onto a nearby bench. "The heart doesn't have chambers that must be emptied before they can be filled again. It has the capacity to hold all the love we're brave enough to allow into it. You speak like someone who has wrestled with such questions herself." "I've buried a husband, 2 sons and a daughter," Brynhild said matter-of-factly. "Elin is my only surviving child, and Bjorn my only grandchild. I know something about the weight of memory and the fear of future loss." The admission hung between them like a confession. Hakon understood now why the older woman sometimes looked at her daughter and grandson with such fierce protectiveness, why she had been willing to risk everything on the dangerous journey to the market town. "Is that why you left your village? Because you couldn't bear to lose them too?" "Partly," Brynhild admitted, "but also because I'm dying, and I wanted to see them settled somewhere safe before I can no longer help them." The words hit Hakon like a physical blow. He had suspected illness, but hearing the truth spoken aloud made it real in a way that observation could not. "How long?" he asked quietly. The village healer thought perhaps until spring, if I'm careful. Maybe longer with proper rest and medicines. She looked up at him, with eyes that held no self-pity, only practical acceptance. "That's why we were so desperate to reach the market town. I needed to know Elin and Bjorn would have opportunities before. They have opportunities here," Hakon said firmly. "They have a home here for as long as they want it. And you have time here to rest, to heal if possible, to watch your grandson grow." Brynhild's composure finally cracked, tears spilling down her weathered cheeks. "You don't understand what you're offering. Watching someone die is something I've done before," Hakon interrupted gently. "I held my own father as fever took him. I've sat with dying friends and dying enemies. Death isn't unfamiliar to me, Brynhild. What's unfamiliar is having people in my life worth grieving for." The honesty of the statement surprised them both. Hakon realized he had just admitted something he hadn't fully acknowledged to himself, that these three strangers had already become precious to him, worth the risk of future heartbreak. "You would do that?" she asked. "Take on the burden of caring for a dying woman and her family?" "It wouldn't be a burden," Hakon said simply. "It would be a privilege." Later, as he finally sought his own bed, Hakon reflected on how completely his world had changed in the space of a single week. The hall that had echoed with emptiness now hummed with life and purpose. The future that had once stretched before him like an endless winter now held the promise of meaningful days, even if they came with the certainty of eventual sorrow. Standing at his chamber window, looking out over the snow-covered landscape that sparkled under the stars, Hakon felt something he hadn't experienced in 7 years, gratitude for what he had, rather than despair for what he had lost. The riders came 3 weeks after the storm, their horses black against the white landscape, and their intentions as cold as the wind that announced their approach. Hakon spotted them from the great window of his hall, 6 men in dark cloaks, moving with the purposeful gait of those who travelled on urgent business. Something about their formation and the way they scanned his estate as they approached set warning bells ringing in his mind. "Gunnar," he called to his steward, who was helping Elin organize the latest batch of correspondence. "We have visitors, armed visitors by the look of them." The old man hurried to the window, his weathered face creasing with concern as he studied the approaching party. "I don't recognize them, master. They're not from any of the local villages." Elin appeared at Hakon's shoulder, Bjorn balanced on her hip. The baby had grown visibly in the weeks since their arrival, his cheeks fuller and his eyes brighter with the robust health that came from warmth and abundance. At the sight of the riders, however, Elin's face went pale as fresh snow. "What is it?" Hakon asked, noting her reaction. "Do you know these men?" Before she could answer, Brynhild emerged from the kitchen, took one look out the window, and sank heavily into the nearest chair. "Olaf Ironside," she whispered. "I had hoped, but no, it seems we cannot escape our past so easily." The name struck Hakon like a blow from a war hammer. Olaf Ironside was a minor jarl from the southern territories, a man known for his ruthless business practices and his particular talent for finding profit in other people's misfortunes. He dealt in debts and obligations, buying up failing farms and struggling households for a fraction of their worth, then working them until they produced enough to justify the investment. "What does Olaf Ironside want with you?" Hakon asked, though a cold suspicion was already forming in his mind. "The village debt," Elin said quietly, her arms tightening protectively around her son. "When the harvest failed and the sickness came, the council borrowed silver to buy grain and medicines. They put up the entire village as collateral, every farm, every building, every household. And when they couldn't repay?" Hakon's voice carried the dangerous edge that had once made enemy raiders think twice about attacking his ships. "Olaf claimed everything," Brynhild finished. "That's the real reason we left Greyrock. Not just because resources were scarce, but because we were no longer free to stay. Everyone in the village now belongs to him, their labor, their possessions, their children's futures." The riders had reached the courtyard now, and their leader, a tall man with iron-grey hair and calculating eyes, was dismounting with the confident air of someone accustomed to having his demands met without question. Hakon could see other men spreading out around his estate, not quite surrounding it, but positioning themselves strategically nonetheless. "Stay here," Hakon commanded, already moving toward his weapons rack. "Keep Bjorn quiet and stay away from the windows." "Hakon, wait," Elin called after him. "There's something else you need to know. Something we should have told you from the beginning." He paused, one hand already on the hilt of his sword, and turned back to face her. The guilt in her expression told him that whatever she was about to reveal would change everything. "We didn't just stumble upon your hall by accident," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "Mama knew this place, knew your reputation. We came here deliberately, hoping to use me," Hakon finished, his voice flat with sudden understanding. To use my wealth and my name to protect you from Olaf's claim. No, Elin protested, but Brynhild raised a weathered hand to stop her. Yes, the older woman said simply. That was our intention. When we learned that Olaf was coming to collect what he saw as his property, I told Elin about the great Hakon Eriksson, who lived alone in the mountains, wealthy enough to buy our freedom, powerful enough to stand against men like Olaf Ironside. The betrayal hit Hakon harder than any physical blow. For 3 weeks, he had allowed himself to believe that fate had brought these people to his door, that their presence was a gift meant to heal his broken heart. To learn that it had all been calculated, that their kindness and companionship had been tools in a larger strategy, made him feel like the naive fool he supposed he was. So the storm was convenient, but not coincidental, he said coldly. You would have found some other excuse to seek my hospitality. The storm was real, Elin said urgently. Our need for shelter was real. And everything that's happened since, the way Bjorn has taken to you, the way you've made us feel welcome, the way this hall has become a home, all of that is real too. Is it? Hakon asked. Or is it just part of a performance designed to secure my protection? Heavy footsteps on the stone outside announced that Olaf and his men had reached the great doors. The sound of iron-shod boots echoed through the hall like the march of doom, and baby Bjorn began to fuss, sensing the tension that filled the air. Master Hakon, Brynhild said, rising from her chair with obvious effort, I won't lie to you anymore. Yes, we came here with ulterior motives. Yes, we hoped to use your reputation to shield us from Olaf's claim. But what I didn't expect, what none of us expected, was that we would come to care for you as more than just a potential protector. The knock came then, not the desperate pounding of travelers seeking shelter, but the measured, authoritative rapping of someone accustomed to having doors opened quickly. Hakon stood frozen between his anger at the deception and his growing understanding that the emotions of the past weeks, whatever their origin, had become genuine. Please, Elin whispered, tears streaming down her face. Whatever you decide about us, don't let him take Bjorn. He's just a baby. He doesn't deserve to grow up as anyone's property. The pleading in her voice, the terror in her eyes, and the way she held her child against her heart, all of it combined to cut through Hakon's anger like a blade through silk. Whatever lies had brought them to his door, the love they shared for each other and the danger they faced were undeniably real. The knocking came again, more insistent this time, followed by a voice that carried clearly through the heavy wood. Hakon Eriksson, I am Olaf Ironside, and I come to reclaim property that belongs to me. Open these doors, or I will open them myself. Hakon looked at the 3 people who had become his makeshift family, the dying woman who had gambled everything on his generosity, the desperate mother who had sought his protection through deception, and the innocent child who had reawakened his capacity for love. The trust he had given them felt shattered, but the care he had developed for them remained intact, despite everything. When this is over, he said quietly, we will have words about truth and trust. But first, he turned toward the doors, his hand settling firmly on his sword hilt. First, we deal with the man who thinks he can claim what is mine. The confusion on Elin's face was almost comical. What is yours? Hakon's smile was grim but determined. My household, my people, my responsibility to protect those who have sought shelter under my roof. He paused, his voice growing gentler. My family, whether they came to me through fate or calculation. As he strode toward the doors to face Olaf Ironside, Hakon realized that the deception that had brought them together mattered less than the bonds they had forged since. Whatever game these women had been playing when they arrived, it had become real for all of them. Now it was time to see whether those bonds were strong enough to withstand the test of a man who made his living breaking apart families and claiming the pieces. Hakon lifted the heavy wooden bar that secured his great doors and pulled one side open just wide enough to face his unwelcome visitors. Olaf Ironside stood on the threshold like a crow, waiting for carrion. his pale eyes taking inventory of everything they could see beyond Hakon's massive frame. Behind him, his 5 companions arranged themselves in a loose semicircle, not quite threatening, but positioned to act quickly if the situation required it. "Olaf," Hakon said by way of greeting, his tone carefully neutral. "You're far from your usual territory. Business takes me where it takes me," Olaf replied, with a thin smile that never reached his eyes. "I believe you have something that belongs to me. I have many things. You'll need to be more specific." Olaf's smile widened, revealing teeth that were too sharp and too white. 2 women and a child. Fled from Grey Rock Village before I could properly catalogue my new acquisitions. I've been tracking them across half the territory. Expensive work, but I always collect what's owed to me. And what makes you think they're here? Tracks in the snow, smoke from your chimney, and the fact that there are precious few places in these mountains where desperate people can find shelter. Olaf stepped closer, and Hakon caught the scent of expensive oils and underlying corruption. "You've always been known for your hospitality, Hakon Eriksson. Sometimes to a fault." The implied threat hung in the cold air between them. Hakon was acutely aware of Elin and Brynhild behind him, probably straining to hear every word of this conversation that would determine their fate. Baby Bjorn had fallen silent, as if even he understood the gravity of the moment. "Assuming such people were under my roof," Hakon said carefully, "what claim would you have on them?" Olaf reached into his cloak and withdrew a leather document case, from which he produced a scroll sealed with official wax. "Legal ownership properly documented and witnessed. The village council of Grey Rock pledged every soul in their settlement as collateral against a loan of silver. When they defaulted, all assets became mine, including any villagers who might have wandered off before the transfer was complete." Hakon accepted the document but didn't bother to read it. He had seen enough such papers in his time to know they were usually legitimate, however morally questionable. The law favored creditors, especially those wealthy enough to purchase debts from desperate communities. "Impressive paperwork," he said, handing it back. "But it seems to me you have a problem." "Oh? And what would that be?" "These people you're looking for, if they exist, are no longer villagers of Grey Rock. They're members of my household, my employees. My responsibility," Olaf's eyes narrowed. "Employment doesn't void existing obligations. They were born in Grey Rock, raised in Grey Rock, and bound by the agreements their village council made. That makes them mine, regardless of any work arrangements you might have offered them." "Does it?" Hakon asked mildly. "I was under the impression that free people could choose their own allegiances. Has the law changed so much in recent years?" "The law is clear about debts and collateral," Olaf replied, his voice hardening. "And I didn't ride through 3 days of snow to engage in philosophical debates about personal freedom." Behind Olaf, his men were growing restless. Hakon counted them again. 6 total, all armed, all with the lean, watchful look of professional soldiers rather than simple farmhands. Olaf had come prepared for resistance, which suggested he expected it. "Perhaps we could discuss this like civilized men," Hakon suggested, stepping aside to allow them entry. "The weather is harsh, and there's no need for any of us to freeze while we sort out these legal complexities." Olaf hesitated, clearly suspicious of the invitation. But the wind had picked up again, driving fresh snow across the courtyard, and even his weathered soldiers were beginning to show signs of discomfort. "Very well," he said finally, "but this is a business matter, not a social call. I'll state my claim, you'll produce my property, and we can all be on our way." As the 6 men filed into his hall, Hakon felt the familiar weight of tactical calculation settling over his mind. It had been years since he'd needed to think like a warrior, but the skills came back readily enough. 6 against 1 in open combat would be difficult but not impossible. He had faced worse odds during his raiding days. But this wasn't just about him anymore. He had Elin and Brynhild to protect, not to mention baby Bjorn, and any violence in the hall could easily endanger them. No, this would require a different approach, one that used his wealth and reputation rather than his sword arm. Olaf's men spread out through the hall, their eyes taking in the rich tapestries, the gleaming weapons, the obvious signs of prosperity that marked Hakon as a man of substance. Olaf himself moved toward the great hearth, where Elin and Brynhild waited with the careful stillness of deer sensing wolves. "Well, well," he said, his voice dripping false pleasantness. "Brynhild Olafsdottir and her daughter Elin, and the child, of course, young Bjorn, isn't it? You've led me quite a chase." "They're under my protection," Hakon said firmly, moving to position himself between Olaf and his family. The word had slipped out naturally, but it felt right. These people were his family now, whatever deceptions had brought them together. Protection. Olaf laughed, a sound like iron scraping against stone. From what? From fulfilling their legal obligations? From working to pay off debts their own village council incurred? From being treated as property rather than people, Hakon replied. There's a difference between honest work and slavery, even if your documents don't acknowledge it. Olaf's expression hardened. Careful, Hakon Eriksson. Your reputation for fairness is well known, but it doesn't give you the right to interfere with legitimate business arrangements. My reputation, Hakon mused, is based on more than fairness. It's also based on protecting those who cannot protect themselves, and on making very unpleasant things happen to people who threaten my household. The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Several of Olaf's men shifted nervously, clearly recognizing the dangerous undertone in Hakon's voice. But Olaf himself seemed unimpressed. Threats now? How disappointing. I had hoped we could settle this without unpleasantness. As did I, Hakon agreed. Which is why I'm prepared to make you an offer. Interest flickered in Olaf's pale eyes. What sort of offer? The original debt, how much was it? 50 pounds of silver, plus interest and collection costs. Call it 70 pounds total. It was a substantial sum, but well within Hakon's means. He had paid more for a single tapestry in his hall, but he also knew that simply buying their freedom would only encourage Olaf to continue his predatory practices with other desperate communities. I'll give you 100 pounds of silver, Hakon said, watching surprise flicker across Olaf's face. But not as payment for people who were never yours to begin with. Then what? As compensation for the inconvenience of your wasted journey and the cost of finding other workers for whatever enterprise you had planned. Hakon's smile was as cold as winter morning. Consider it a generous settlement for the misunderstanding about these people's status. Olaf studied him for a long moment, clearly weighing his options. 100 pounds of silver was more than he had expected to collect, and it came without the ongoing costs of feeding and housing workers who might prove reluctant or unproductive. But accepting it would also mean acknowledging that his claim had been questionable from the start. And if I refuse your generous offer, he asked. Hakon's hand moved to rest casually on his sword hilt. Around the hall, he noticed Gunnar and his other servants positioning themselves strategically, loyal retainers, ready to defend their master's home. The odds were improving. Then we discover whether your legal documents are worth more than my resolve to protect my family, Hakon said simply. I should warn you, I've never been particularly impressed by paperwork. The tension in the hall stretched taut as a bowstring. Baby Bjorn chose that moment to let out a small cry, and the sound seemed to break something in the air between the two groups of men. Elin moved to comfort her child, and the sight of mother and baby seemed to remind everyone present what was actually at stake. 150 pounds, Olaf said finally. Silver, not trade goods. And I want your word that these people will remain in this territory. I won't have them showing up in some other village, claiming they've escaped legitimate obligations. Hakon felt relief flood through him, though he was careful not to let it show on his face. Done. But I want your word in return that you'll consider their obligations to Greyrock fully satisfied. No future claims, no attempts to collect additional debts or interest. Agreed. As they shook hands on the arrangement, Hakon caught Elin's eye across the hall. The gratitude in her expression was almost overwhelming, but there was something else there too. A promise that the conversation about truth and trust would indeed happen once this immediate danger had passed. For now, though it was enough to know that his family was safe, that they would remain together in the home they had all learned to love. The silver he would pay was nothing compared to the price of losing them, and infinitely less than the cost of learning to live with loneliness again. The transaction took place at the great table where Hakon had once held his solitary feasts, but now the massive surface served a different purpose entirely. Gunnar brought the silver from Hakon's strongbox, heavy ingots marked with his personal seal, each one worth more than most families saw in a year. The metal gleamed in the firelight as Olaf's men counted and weighed each piece with the practiced efficiency of those accustomed to handling large sums. 150 pounds. "It's agreed," Hakon said, watching Olaf examine the silver with barely concealed satisfaction. "I trust this settles all obligations." "It does indeed," Olaf replied, producing another document from his leather case. "This releases any claims I might have had on the people in question. They are, as you so eloquently put it, no longer my concern." As quill touched parchment and the legal formalities were completed, Hakon felt something fundamental shift in the atmosphere of his hall. The silver on the table represented more than just a transaction. It was the price of freedom, the cost of family, the weight of choosing love over law. Elin stood near the hearth with Bjorn in her arms, her face a mixture of relief and residual fear. She had lived for weeks under the shadow of Olaf's claim, never quite believing that safety was possible. Even now, with the papers signed and the silver counted, she seemed afraid to trust that this nightmare was truly ending. Brynhild, meanwhile, had settled into her chair with the careful movements of someone conserving limited strength. The stress of the confrontation had clearly taken its toll on her already fragile health, but her eyes blazed with fierce satisfaction as she watched Olaf prepare to leave. "One more thing," Olaf said, as his men began packing the silver into leather satchels. "I'm curious about something, Hakon Eriksson. What makes 3 strangers worth such a substantial sum? Surely it's not just Christian charity. You've never been known for that particular weakness." The question hung in the air like a challenge. Hakon could have deflected it, could have claimed simple humanitarian impulses or a desire to thwart Olaf's predatory practices. But something about this moment, the weight of what they had all been through, the bonds that had been forged and tested, demanded complete honesty. "They're not strangers anymore," he said simply. "They're family." Olaf's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Family? You've known them for what, a month?" "Family isn't always about blood or time," Hakon replied, his gaze moving to encompass Elin, Brynhild, and baby Bjorn. "Sometimes it's about the choice to stand together when everything else falls apart. About finding people worth protecting, worth building a life around." "How remarkably sentimental," Olaf said with a thin smile. "I hope your new family appreciates the fortune you've spent on their freedom." "I'm sure they do," Hakon said coolly. "Just as I'm sure you appreciate being able to leave my hall with your men intact and your business intact. Some things are worth more than silver, Olaf. I suggest you remember that in your future dealings." The threat was subtle but clear. Olaf had gotten what he came for, but he had also learned that there were limits to how far legal documents could be pushed against determined opposition. As he and his men prepared to depart, the balance of power in the room had shifted decisively. "The roads are treacherous this time of year," Hakon added as Olaf gathered his cloak. "I trust you'll reach your destination safely." "I'm sure we will," Olaf replied. "We're very experienced travelers." "Excellent. Gunnar will see you out." As the doors closed behind their unwelcome visitors, silence fell over the hall like a blanket. For long moments, no one spoke, as if they were all afraid that words might somehow summon Olaf back or undo the freedom that had been so dearly purchased. Finally, baby Bjorn let out a happy gurgle, reaching toward the firelight with chubby fingers, and the sound broke the spell that had held them all frozen. "Is it really over?" Elin asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's over," Hakon confirmed, moving toward them with measured steps. "You're free. All of you. No more running, no more hiding, no more fear that someone will come to drag you away." Brynhild began to weep, Not the quiet tears of earlier, but deep, racking sobs that seemed to release weeks of accumulated terror and desperation. Elin knelt beside her mother's chair, baby Bjorn balanced on one arm, while she embraced the older woman with the other. "We owe you everything," Elin said, looking up at Hakon through her own tears. "How can we ever—" "You owe me nothing," Hakon interrupted. "The debt was mine to pay. You brought life back to this hall when I thought it would be empty forever. If anything, I'm the one in your debt." But even as he spoke the words, Hakon knew that the conversation about truth and deception still lay ahead of them. The immediate crisis had passed, but the foundations of trust between them would need to be rebuilt on more solid ground than the desperate lies that had brought them together. For now, though, it was enough to know that they were safe, that they were free, and that they would have the chance to forge something real from the ashes of their shared deceptions. After Gunnar had cleared away the remnants of the negotiation and retired for the evening, Hakon found himself alone with his newfound family in the warm glow of the dying fire. The hall felt different now, not just safe, but truly theirs in a way it hadn't been before. The silver he had spent was already forgotten, but the words that needed to be spoken still hung heavy in the air between them. Elin sat beside the cradle where Bjorn slept peacefully, one hand resting protectively on the carved edge. Brynhild occupied her usual chair, though exhaustion had carved deeper lines around her eyes. The confrontation with Olaf had cost her more than the others, and Hakon could see how carefully she was breathing. "We need to talk," he said gently, settling into his own chair. "All of us. About how this began, about what it's become, and about what happens now." Elin's hand stilled on the cradle. "I know what you must think of us. What we did, coming here under false pretenses, letting you believe—" "What I think," Hakon interrupted, "is that three people faced an impossible situation and made the only choice they could see. But I also think we can't build a future on foundations of deception, no matter how understandable those deceptions might have been." Brynhild straightened in her chair, her pale eyes meeting his directly. "You want the whole truth." "I want us to start fresh," Hakon said, "with everything honest between us. No more secrets, no more half-truths, no more wondering what's real and what's performance." "The truth is complicated," Brynhild said slowly. "Yes, we came here deliberately. Yes, we hope to use your reputation for protection. But the storm that brought us to your door, that was real. Our desperation was real. And everything that's happened since has been the most honest thing in my life for 7 years, Hakon finished. "Which is why the deception hurt so much. Not because you sought my help, but because you made me doubt whether any of it was genuine." Elin looked up from the cradle, tears brightening her eyes. "It was genuine, all of it. The way Bjorn took to you, the way you made us feel welcome, the way this place became home. None of that was pretense." "Then help me understand," Hakon said. "Help me separate what was calculation from what was real." For the next hour, they talked with the kind of brutal honesty that either destroys relationships or transforms them into something unbreakable. Brynhild spoke about the desperation that had driven them from their village, about the nights she had lain awake, planning their approach to the legendary Hakon Eriksson. Elin admitted to the fear that had consumed her, not just of Olaf, but of raising her son in a world where he might never be truly free. "I rehearsed what I would say to you," Elin confessed. "How I would present our situation to gain your sympathy. But the moment you opened those doors, the moment you looked at Bjorn with such gentleness, everything I had planned to say just disappeared." "What replaced it?" Hakon asked. "Hope," she said simply. "Real hope, not the desperate kind we'd been clinging to. Hope that maybe we could find something here worth staying for, worth fighting for." Hakon felt something loosening in his chest, not the tight bands of grief he had carried for so long, but the newer tension of uncertainty and betrayal. These people had indeed deceived him, but they had also given him something precious in return, a reason to care about the future again. "And what about now?" he asked. "Now that Olaf is gone, and you're truly free to choose your own path, what do you want?" The question hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Brynhild reached across the space between their chairs to take his hand, her weathered fingers warm against his palm. "I want to spend whatever time I have left watching my grandson grow up in a place where he's loved and protected," she said. "I want to see my daughter build a life that has joy in it, not just survival." "And you?" Hakon asked Elin. She was quiet for a long moment, her gaze moving from her sleeping son to the man who had become so much more than their protector. "I want to belong somewhere, to be part of something larger than just getting through each day. I want Bjorn to have a father figure who will teach him to be strong and kind. Her voice caught. "I want to stay if you'll have us. Not as obligations or guests, but as family." The words settled between them with the weight of promise and possibility. Hakon looked at these three people who had transformed his empty hall into a home, his solitary existence into something worth celebrating. The deception that had brought them together seemed suddenly insignificant compared to the truth they had built since. "Then stay," he said simply. "Stay and help me remember what it means to be alive rather than just surviving. Stay and let me be the man I was before grief hollowed me out." Baby Bjorn stirred in his cradle, making soft sounds of contentment, and Hakon realized that the child represented everything he had thought, lost forever. Hope, continuity, the promise that love could triumph over loss. They were a family now, forged not by blood or law, but by choice and commitment, and the shared recognition that some things were worth any sacrifice to protect. Spring came early that year, melting the snow from the mountain peaks and filling the air with the promise of new beginnings. From his position at the great window, Hakon could see green shoots pushing through the dark soil of Brynhild's herb garden, their tender leaves reaching toward the warming sun. The sight filled him with a contentment he had never expected to feel again. Behind him, the hall buzzed with the gentle activity of a household that had found its rhythm. Elin sat at the great table, with the estate's ledgers spread before her, her careful script recording the spring plantings and the birth of new calves. She had proven herself invaluable as his steward, bringing an efficiency and attention to detail that impressed even the most traditional of his neighbors. Baby Bjorn, now almost a year old, had learned to pull himself upright using the furniture and was attempting his first tentative steps between Brynhild and the carved chair legs. His delighted laughter echoed through the hall whenever he managed more than 2 steps without falling, and the sound never failed to bring a smile to Hakon's weathered face. "He'll be running by midsummer," Brynhild observed from her seat beside the hearth. The winter had been hard on her, but the spring medicines and careful nursing had brought back some color to her cheeks. The village healer's grim predictions had proven too pessimistic. Love and security, it seemed, were powerful medicine, running and getting into everything he shouldn't, Elin added without looking up from her accounts. "Yesterday I found him trying to climb the weapons rack, a warrior in the making," Hakon said proudly. "He'll need to know how to handle a blade when he comes of age. He'll need to know how to handle a pen just as well," Elin replied. "The world is changing. Intelligence and education matter as much as strength now." It was an ongoing debate between them, not an argument, but the kind of comfortable disagreement that marked families who cared enough to worry about the future. Hakon had gradually come to appreciate Elin's perspective on many things, just as she had learned to value his experience and hard-won wisdom. The sound of approaching horses drew Hakon's attention back to the window. A small party was making its way up the mountain path, not the threatening formation of Olaf's men, but the familiar figures of local merchants and village elders who had come to rely on Hakon's counsel in matters of trade and law. "More visitors," he announced. "Gunnar, prepare refreshments for our guests." The old steward nodded and hurried away, his movements more spry than they had been in years. The transformation of the household had energized everyone who served in it, as if the return of life and laughter had reminded them all why their work mattered. As the visitors were welcomed and settled, Hakon found himself observing the scene with deep satisfaction. This was how the hall was meant to be, filled with voices and purpose, serving as a center of activity for the surrounding communities. For 7 years, he had let it become a monument to grief. Now, it was what Astrid had always envisioned, a place where people came together to solve problems, celebrate successes, and build connections that strengthened the entire region. Later that evening, after the visitors had departed with promises of continued cooperation and mutual support, Hakon stood once again before the family runestone. But this time, he was not alone. Elin approached quietly, carrying a sleeping Bjorn in her arms, while Brynhild followed at her careful pace. "I wanted to introduce them properly," Hakon said, running his fingers over the carved names. "Astrid, Eric, Sigrid, Magnus, meet the family that brought me back to life. Do you think they would approve?" Elin asked softly. Hakon considered the question seriously. He had spent countless hours wondering what his first family would think of the love he had found with his second. But gradually, he had come to understand that love was not a finite resource to be rationed among the deserving. The heart that had learned to love deeply could learn to love again, without diminishing what had come before. "I think they would be grateful," he said finally. "Astrid especially would be happy to know that this hall rings with children's laughter again, that there are people here who care for each other and build something meaningful together." Brynhild placed a weathered hand on his arm. "They live on in what you've become, in how you've chosen to honor their memory by embracing new life rather than withdrawing from it." As spring deepened into summer, Hakon often reflected on the Christmas Eve that had changed everything. What had begun with 3 desperate strangers seeking shelter from a storm had evolved into something far richer and more complex than any of them could have imagined. The deception that had initially brought them together had given way to trust earned through shared challenges and daily kindnesses. Bjorn took his first real steps on Midsummer's Day, tottering across the great hall with his arms outstretched toward Hakon's waiting embrace. The joy on the child's face as he accomplished this momentous feat filled the hall with celebration. And Hakon realized that this was what he had been missing for 7 years. Not just companionship, but the privilege of witnessing life's small miracles unfold. Brynhild's health continued to improve with each passing month, though they all understood that her time remained precious. She spent her days teaching Bjorn his first words, sharing stories of the old ways with Elin, and helping Hakon plan improvements to the estate that would benefit future generations. "This is what family means," she said one evening, as they sat around the great table sharing the evening meal. "Not just blood relations, but people who choose to build something beautiful together, who support each other through trials and celebrate each other's victories." Looking around that table, at the woman who had become like a daughter to him, at the child who would grow up calling him grandfather, at the matriarch whose wisdom guided them all, Hakon felt a peace he had never expected to know again. The empty feast table of his solitary years had been transformed into a gathering place for a family bound not by obligation, but by love freely. Given and gratefully received, sometimes the greatest gifts came disguised as desperate strangers, seeking shelter from the storm.